In 1987, a Finnish cartographer unexpectedly discovered something while mapping a Boy Scout region in Missouri.
The sun was glinting off this white object. You could tell right away it was a skull.
This eerie discovery kicked off a mystery.
This is probably going to be one that we won't be able to solve.
Detectives can't tell if it's a recent crime or ancient history.
And Bun Chee Nyhuis actually came alive in her own trial.
My partner and we looked at each other and we just couldn't believe it.
The S.Bar.F. Boy Scout Ranch spans 5,400 acres of stunning rural Missouri landscape. While exploring a secluded part of the ranch, a map maker stumbled upon a human skull. Tina Orling was his supervisor.
He was a professional map maker from Finland, and he saw the skull within the first few days here. He did not say anything to me or to anyone else about it because he was afraid.
However, Tina was finally informed about the discovery 3 months later, just before he returned to Finland. Tina and the Scout Rangers searched for the remains using a detailed map of the ranch and following the directions marked on the map. They found what they were seeking in a lightly wooded clearing.
The sun was glinting off this white object. You could tell right away it was a skull. And I thought to myself, oh boy, we finally found it.
Along with the remains, the searchers found a few strands of hair, a lower jawbone, and approximately 40 bone fragments, including parts of a pelvic bone, a thigh bone, and some rib fragments.
My initial thought was that it may possibly be an Indian grave until we saw the blue jean material.
Investigators also came across an old pair of jeans, some pieces of a floral shirt, fragments of a plastic bag, and a metal button. To kick off the identification process, they sent the physical evidence over to the forensic lab in Jefferson City, Missouri. They started by looking at the worn blue jeans. The outer seam was still in good shape, which helped forensic expert Tom Grant figure out the person's height. The outer seam measured 37 inches from the cuff to the waistband.
Based on that outside measurement, the inside seam length would probably have been approximately 27 to 28 inches, which is from a short person who would have worn that pair of jeans.
Grant figured the person was roughly 5 feet tall. Experts took a look at the soil and discovered some odd signs, like a white substance blended in with the dirt.
The trace section of our laboratory analyzed those and determined the presence of calcium carbonate, which could have been a byproduct of calcium oxide, which is lime.
People put lime there to either stop the odor of the decomposing body or to actually cause it to decompose faster.
Experts took a close look at the hair discovered at the gravesite. Normally, hair can be linked to different ancestries, but this particular sample was pretty messed up. The only definite thing they could say was that it didn't come from someone of African descent.
The hair on the left is the hair from the gravesite. The hair that's on the right is a Negroid or African-American head hair, and its characteristics differ considerably from that at the gravesite. So I would determine that the hair at the gravesite is not of African-American origin.
It seems like the person in question was probably a woman of European background, around 5 feet tall. The police passed this info along to the National Crime Center, which keeps tabs on missing people in the U.S. and Canada.
And that was unsuccessful. We believed it to be murder. The problem was identifying who the victim was.
Really, the first thought on my mind was this is probably going to be one that we won't be able to solve.
Was the police investigation headed in the right direction? A tiny clue discovered in the shallow grave was about to shift everything and send detectives across the globe. Investigators thought the skeletal remains in the shallow grave had been there for under 8 years and probably belonged to a small woman of European background. But one clue had them scratching their heads from the beginning: a tiny metal button discovered next to the remains.
Half of it was somewhat rusted and deteriorated, but the upper half had a logo that was stamped on it. The letters TEXWOOD was present, Tex Wood, and in the O's there was a star-type pattern that was present. None of us at our laboratory had ever seen or heard of that logo before.
The FBI didn't have a clue about any company or product called Texwood.
So we began calling all over the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Couldn't find it. So I called a friend of mine with U.S. Customs.
Special Agent Timothy Quinn from U.S. Customs typed Texwood into his computer. What he found gave detectives their first important lead in figuring out who the person was.
Checks of our computerized importer files were negative. Then had to make a series of phone calls, the last of which was to our national import specialists in New York. And from the Office of the National Import Specialist, we were able to determine that the name Texwood is a make of jeans that was manufactured strictly for consumption in Asia. The brand was not intended to be exported to the United States.
It seemed like the person might have gone to Asia before she passed away and picked up the jeans there, or maybe she had Asian roots. To dig deeper, the bones were initially sent to anthropologists at the University of Missouri and later to Colorado State University.
If you have the right bones, you can find out everything you need. You don't need a complete skeleton. The more you have, the more complete picture you can have.
A skull can give an anthropologist clues about a person's gender and background. The first thing they did was sort the skull into general geographic categories like European, African, Asian, or Native American. The characteristics of the skull, such as wide, squared cheekbones, pointed to an Asian heritage. This helped the anthropologist back up the police's theory that the skull came from someone of Asian descent.
The bridge of the nose, the squared cheekbones, the overall smaller features led them to believe that this was a Mongoloid.
The anthropologist verified that the victim was a woman. The closed cranial sutures and dental wear pointed to her being in her mid-20s. The bones had smooth surfaces, indicating she wasn't very muscular, and experts estimated her weight to be about 120 pounds. A look at her pelvic bone showed a distinct groove, which usually appears after having at least 2 kids. This groove indicated that she had given birth to at least 2 children. However, despite all this information, the investigation hit a wall.
It's very frustrating because you cannot start the investigation of who committed the crime until you determine who the victim is. And you continually, it's like spinning your wheels, not going anywhere until you can identify the victim.
With only a handful of leads remaining, the next move was to put together a facial reconstruction from the unknown skull. The bone remains gave the authorities some important clues. They identified the person as an Asian woman who had had at least 2 kids, was about 5 feet tall, and weighed roughly 120 pounds. But what was her face like? The police turned to anthropologists to use facial reconstruction methods to bring the skull's appearance to life. To start off, a latex mold of the real skull is created. After the mold is finished, the original skull can be handed back to the police for evidence purposes. The latex mold is then utilized to make a plaster cast. Rubber pegs, called landmarks, are added to the plaster cast to indicate tissue thickness at different spots on the face, which can differ depending on factors like gender, ethnicity, and age. In the end, clay strips are used to link the landmarks and form the facial contours.
Each individual skull is like a blueprint or a fingerprint. No two are alike. We follow this blueprint then to create our faces, following the shape, the bends of each skull.
The spaces between the clay strips are filled in to finish the facial reconstruction. Plastic eyes are placed in the eye sockets and the eyelids are formed. Final touches like the nose and lips are added. Taking into account the victim's Asian background, the reconstruction is completed with a black wig. Even though they didn't know who the victim was, the reconstructed face turned out to be super important for the case. The police shared photos of the reconstruction with local newspapers and TV stations in nearby towns, trying to get some tips. They got a response in just 3 days. Willie Porn Cox was chilling out in front of the TV when the bust made an appearance on the local news.
Then I call my husband, tell my husband what I saw in the TV.
Carmen, her husband, spotted the bust in a newspaper and immediately recognized it too.
Called her back. I said, boy, It's awful close. I think we ought to do something.
The Coxes thought the bust looked a lot like their friend, 33-year-old Bun Chee Nyhuis. She used to live in a nearby town, but they hadn't seen her in 5 years. They told the police that Bun Chee had left her husband, Richard, and gone back to Thailand. Richard Nyhuis seemed skeptical when asked about the skull discovered at the Boy Scout ranch, which is about 100 miles from his place. He mentioned that his wife, Bun Chee, had expressed a desire to go back to Thailand and end their marriage. Richard recalled taking her to St. Louis Airport 5 years ago for her flight to Thailand, and that was the last time he and the kids saw her or heard from her. Neighbors backed him up, saying that Bun Chee had indeed mentioned wanting to return to Thailand.
I knew. She told me she had gotten her passport. She had gotten her citizenship and her passport. So it wouldn't have surprised me, if she had done that.
She mentioned to me, she's not happy. She like to go Thailand, visit family.
If Bun Chee was indeed the woman discovered in that shallow grave, then why hasn't her family in Thailand reported her missing in the last 5 years? To get the answers they were looking for, investigators reached out to scientists to analyze the bones. Did Bun Chee Nyhuis really abandon her 2 kids and head back to Thailand like her husband said, or did they actually find her remains in a shallow grave at the Boy Scout ranch? The solution was found in the skull using a technique called skull photograph superimposition. The police got a photo of Bun Chee from her husband, Richard, and sent it over to the anthropology department at Colorado State University, along with a picture of another missing woman from Georgia. Dr. Michael Charney, a well-known forensic anthropologist from Colorado State University, took a close look at the photographs. He set the skull in the same position as the women in the pictures, and then layered slides of the skull on top of the images. The skull didn't fit the woman from Georgia, but it lined up perfectly with Bun Chee Nyhuis's photo.
Face is at an angle. She's clowning around, making a face. We find that the jawline is within the chin. The top is within the top of the head. The cheek is within. The eyes are in the orbits. The nasal opening corresponds to the nose, and the teeth match up very nicely to the jawline here. In spite of the fact that it's a very difficult angle to approximate, an expression to approximate, we felt this was a very good match.
After establishing a strong scientific link, the investigators shifted their focus to Richard Nyhuis. They suspected he had more information about his wife's disappearance than he had let on.
Her friends indicated that they had a very volatile relationship, that they argued quite a bit.
The police came across a troubling coincidence. Richard Nyhuis, a Boy Scout leader, often camped at the same Boy Scout property where they discovered Bun Chee's grave.
And I turned to my partner and we looked at each other and we just couldn't believe it. That's when we knew we had to formulate a game plan, and we'd have probably just one shot at him.
It all started fitting together at that point. All the pieces started coming into place.
Richard Nyhuis came clean to the police when they showed him the forensic evidence, even though his stories about what happened didn't quite match up. At first, he said that Bun Chee had just bumped her head by accident during a fight, but later on, he confessed that he had actually suffocated her.
Was bleeding real bad and blood all over the place, and she was yelling, screaming. But put my hands over her mouth and her nose, suffocated her.
After the confession, forensic pathologist Dr. Mary Case took a close look at the skull. She thoroughly examined the small injury on the back of the head and decided it wasn't just a random accident. Instead, she figured that the injury came from a strong blow to the skull.
This is a very limited area. It's pushed inward, and we tend to see this kind of a depressed skull fracture when you strike the head with something that has very forceful impact over a very small striking surface. A hammer would be a good example of something that could do that. It's a tool. It's meant to strike, and all of the force is directed onto a very small striking surface.
Prosecutors determined, using forensic evidence and some details from Nyhuis's confession, that Richard and Bun Chee got into a fight one night in the basement of their house. Bun Chee wanted to relocate to a new place, but Richard shot it down, saying they just couldn't handle the costs. She informed him that she was taking the kids and then walked away. In a moment of anger, he snatched up the closest thing and hit her on the back of the head. The blow didn't kill her right away, but while she was down on the ground, Richard suffocated her. He used a bag to stop the bleeding, wrapped her body in plastic sheets, and stashed her in the freezer for 3 months. Nyhuis made up a tale about driving Bun Chee to St. Louis Airport for her trip to Thailand. When spring came and the ground softened, Richard took Bun Chee's remains to the Boy Scout Ranch, which is about 2 hours from his place. He picked a quiet spot deep in the woods to bury her, but he messed up a few things along the way. The lime he used on the body sped up the decomposition process, and since the burial was just 2 feet deep, it wasn't enough to keep animals from digging up the remains. Plus, Bun Chee was buried in Texwood jeans, a brand exclusive to Asia which gave a big hint. Nyhuis was taken by surprise when his wife's remains were discovered and identified. Key factors in figuring out who she was included a Texwood button, a pelvic bone suggesting she had at least 2 kids, unique skull characteristics, forensic sculpting, and photo overlay techniques. Dr. Case mentioned in court that suffocation usually lasts about 3 to 5 minutes. She pointed out that after just a minute or two, the victim would likely pass out, which suggests that Nyhuis probably put his wife in the freezer while she was still alive. Richard Nyhuis was found guilty of murder and received a life sentence in prison with no chance of parole for 50 years.
It was great forensic science, and of course, that's how it's supposed to work. You get a button, you get a hair, and the expert in that area can tell you. And if you look at the button work, it took about a month. It was less than a month for someone to look at that button and say, well, that's only manufactured in that part of the world. Well, somebody had to collect all that information, and I admire that. I think that's wonderful.
It took all the different scientific and forensic people to make this thing happen, any one piece of which could have stopped the investigation.
One of the unique things about the case was actually having the remains to do the trial. And Bun Chee Nyhuis actually came alive in her own trial. This was one of the few cases where a prosecutor got to try a murder case with the victim actually in the courtroom with him, speaking to the jury.